Quick fact file on Origen, or Origen, not quite sure how that. I'm going to say Origen, it's more natural. He wrote a lot more books than most people. His name, Origenes Adamantius, aka Origen. Born in Alexandria, Egypt, possibly of Greek descent. Dates 185 to 254. Appearance not known, but may have walked with a limp, or two limps. Before he was famous, a zealous, eccentric boy genius. Famous for theology, biblical criticism, mastery of languages, brain box. Why does he matter? He invented the field of biblical criticism. He promoted the symbolic reading of the text. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? Maybe, although heaven knows what theories he would have come up with once he'd had a drink or two inside him. A true original. See what I did there? In 202, a bout of persecution hit Alexandria, and Clement was forced to leave the city and move to Cappadocia. He was succeeded as head of the catechetical school by an 18-year-old called Origen. He was only in his late teens, but he had boy genius written all over him. Not literally, obviously, although if he had, he could have written it in several languages. Origen had a brain the size of a planet, albeit a planet in a seriously eccentric orbit. He nearly didn't make it to take up his new post. During the persecution, his mother had to hide all his clothes to prevent him from running out into the street and declaring himself a Christian. His zeal was such that it threatened to tip him over the edge at points. In his early reading of the Bible, he read Jesus' apparent commendation of eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So, that's Matthew 19:12. So, he castrated himself. After this, not surprisingly, he abandoned a literal approach to the Bible and started reading it more as allegory. Of Genesis, for example, he wrote, "Who is so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted a paradise eastward of Eden and set in it a visible and palpable tree of life, of such a sort that anyone who tasted its fruit with its bodily teeth would gain life?" Origen was the prime exponent of a style of biblical interpretation that has become known as the Alexandrian school. He argued that there are three levels of biblical meaning: literal, moral, and spiritual, and these corresponded to the three levels of human existence: body, soul and spirit. Body, soul, and spirit or intelligence. Not quite clear how that's divided up. Naturally, Origen believed that his three-level thing required an intelligent and spiritually advanced person to interpret it. Someone like, Origen perhaps. There were areas where such readings of the text were heavily resisted, not least at Antioch, where theologians argued for a simpler, more literal reading. The Antioch school and the Alexandrian school ended up having a lot of fights over this one. And just as there was a hierarchy of meanings in the text, Origen believed there was a hierarchy in the Trinity. God at the top, then Jesus, then the Holy Spirit. They were all God, but some of them were more God than the others. But he rejected the idea that the Son was created. Instead, the Son was timelessly, eternally begotten of the Father. All of which shows that he wasn't an orthodox thinker. He was a theological enfant terrible, restlessly, relentlessly independent-minded, endlessly thirsty for knowledge. Almost inevitably, this attitude brought him into conflict with the church authorities. He was eventually banned from preaching in Alexandria by the bishop and moved to Caesarea, a move aided by a large dollop of funding from a rich admirer. In Caesarea, Origen virtually invented the discipline of biblical textual scholarship. He had come to realize that even someone as clever as, Origen, didn't necessarily know all they thought they did. When he engaged in debate with Jewish teachers, the Jews used the Hebrew scriptures. Origen, like all Christians, used the Greek translation, called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, which, while undeniably popular, had some serious mistranslations. The result was that when Christians quoted some of their favourite proof texts from the Old Testament, their Jewish adversaries would torpedo their argument by pointing out either that the verse was a mistranslation or that it was, in fact, completely missing from the original Hebrew. Origen concluded that the Christians needed better tools. So he compiled the Hexapla, the first scientific version of the Bible. Written in 6 parallel columns, it gave the Hebrew text a transliteration of the Hebrew text into Greek, then the Septuagint, and next to that a variety of Greek translations. It took him 15 years to complete and ran to over 6,500 pages in 15 volumes, all written, of course, by hand. It was never copied and was probably destroyed in the 7th century when the library of Caesarea was burned during the Arab invasion. As if that wasn't enough, Origen wrote commentaries on nearly all the books of the Bible, and there was also a large collection of his sermons. It is in the writings of Origen that we first find the phrase New Testament to describe the Christian scriptures, although it was clearly in common usage at the time. For all his braininess, though, there are times when his attempts to solve such issues as the fall of humanity and the incarnation of Jesus lead to fairly wild speculative theology. He was, for example, a universalist. He believed that at the end all would be saved. If the fall was universal, then its reversal, salvation, must also be universal. For these reasons, Origen's work may have been widely admired, but was also viewed with scepticism and suspicion. Eventually, what was called Origenism was condemned at a council in Alexandria in AD 400. His writings were deemed heretical, and many of them were burned, meaning that most of his work is preserved only in fragments. Mind you, for all his theorizing, Origen was no ivory tower scholar. Throughout his life, he visited prisoners in jail and supported the poor. His early desire to be identified publicly for Christ came to fruition in 250, when he was imprisoned, subsequently dying as a result of the brutal treatment he received in prison. He was brave as well as brilliant. Whatever else you might say of Origen, this was a man with cojones. Not literally, obviously.